Hey everyone, welcome back. I figured it was time for a good old-fashioned knitting podcast so I can update you on what I've been working on this year. As always, we're going to start with finished objects. I have two to share. And the first is the Bone sweater by Miyuki Watanabe. You may have seen that I posted a project vlog about this sweater. So if you want to know all the details about what went into making this, you can go watch that. It's a bulky weight drop shoulder. You knit it from the bottom up, and obviously it is all lace. This stitch pattern is sort of like a herringbone pattern, and so I think that's where the name comes from, bone. It's got all these little nice details about it, like the shoulders are in garter stitch, and that carries over onto the back neck. It's got ribbing up the sides of the sweater, which is not only nice to look at, but it's also enjoyable to knit because it kind of breaks up the lace as you're knitting in the round and gives you an opportunity to make sure that you're on track with the stitch pattern. And then those rib stitches get decreased out first thing at the underarm, and then the sleeve is actually knit without any shaping after those initial decreases. I figured I would throw it on so you can see what it looks like on me. I am wearing it with just a black t-shirt underneath it. In the project vlog, I'm wearing it with a black long sleeve, so you can check that out if you want to see what that looks like. Ultimately, whatever you wear underneath it is going to show a little bit because it is all lace. I knit this full length, which I think looks nice, and I knit the smallest size, so there's not a ton of positive ease. There is about 7 or 8 inches of positive ease on me at my full bust, so there is definitely ease, but I think it fits well. It doesn't look like it is oversized. And I also like where the sleeve hits me, especially because the sleeves are just a little bit wider. Since they don't have that shaping, it's definitely not form fitted to my arm. And I just think that this length looks nice with that type of fit. The yarn I used is unfortunately discontinued. It's from Cascade Yarns. It's their Eco Plus Merino. And I do like it. It's a bit of a bummer that it's discontinued. It is merino, so I'm getting a little bit of pilling, mostly like on the underside of the sleeves so far, but it hasn't been too bad. And although it's soft, it's fairly substantial feeling. It doesn't feel like I'm gonna mess it up as I'm wearing it, just going about my day, which I think is pretty good for like a all over lace sweater, because normally I would be pretty careful with something like that, but honestly this kind of feels like a sweatshirt but a little bit nicer. One thing I forgot to mention in the wrap-up section of my vlog is the sleeve shaping of the drop shoulder. So there isn't any shaping, you just pick up the sleeve as normal. But because the short rows at the shoulder are worked in garter stitch, the shoulder is not very stretchy. And if you look at the model's photos, the model is wearing a sweater with more positive ease than what mine is. And so their shoulder comes down a little bit further, and it's more of a straight, or it's more of like a horizontal line. Whereas if you look at mine, it's angled, right? Like the top of this line comes up a little bit higher than the bottom. And so it sort of looks like the arm side is shaped, but it isn't. It's just these garter stitch short rows that are giving this structure to kind of hold it in place. And I actually really like that. I think it's nice that it looks like it's shaped and it looks a little bit more fitted, but I think it worked out really well for me, and overall I'm just really happy with this. I knit it in 13 days. It was very fast, and there aren't a ton of projects on Ravelry, so If you like the way this looks, I definitely recommend buying the pattern. Okay, I'm back in my other sweater and we're gonna be dealing with some shifting light here as the sun sets. This is just what I get for having to film after work. My next FO is my hand-spun Harlow hat. This was part of the spin2knit Harlow cowl that Madison, Mackenzie, and Claire hosted for a couple months. It just wrapped up at the end of January and I got mine finished in time. I'm not extremely happy with it and I'll talk about why. And I think I want to make another one to kind of fix the things that I don't love about this one. I made the fingering weight version and I spun 2 different yarns. There is this lighter green that has got some other colors going on, like this kind of blue-gray and a little bit of like a rusty red, but it's fairly subtle. And then the other yarn that I spun is this really pretty like emerald green that also kind of has some color changes into like black and brown. And I think I actually preferred this side, but I like both sides. I think the colors paired really well together and I'm very happy with the way the colors look. Both braids of fiber were fiber that I had just like as leftovers in my stash that I was really happy to use in a project and get it out of my stash because I didn't really know what to do with either of them, and then I realized that they looked nice together. So this dark one was a colorway that I pulled out of a braid I used in my traveler hoodie. And so I just had all of like the green teal mixed with some black and brown, all of those leftovers in a bag. And so I just spun those all together without really thinking too hard about it. And then the lighter green was just a single braid that I spun end to end. And this was some merino that I got, I think at a fiber festival a couple years ago, and the dyer like doesn't have an online presence, and I also don't remember what their name was, but yeah, so I think it turned out really cute. I actually cast this on as a travel project the night before we had a flight to go on a trip at the start of January. I cast it on and I did the tubular cast on, which is called for in the Harlow pattern. I didn't mention that this is an Andrew Mallory pattern, but I feel like most people would know that. So I cast it on before we left, and then the majority of this I worked while I was on the plane. I actually like simple brioche as a travel project because for every round you see in this hat, there are 2 rounds. And so, you know, something that is ultimately very small and portable, easy to take with you, ends up being a lot of knitting. And I worked on this a lot on the plane, actually, like a surprising amount, because I usually don't love to, or I usually don't knit a lot when I travel. I always take something and then I never end up like working on it, but I knit like the majority of the body of this while I was on a plane, and it's sort of a challenge to like manage the 2 skeins of yarn. So that wasn't like super fun, and that is definitely a reason why brioche would not be fun traveling. But I was knitting so much and I wasn't worried about like running out of hat to knit before I got to the decreases, because I just knew it was going to take a long time. It's just a lot of knitting. That being said, I wish that I had knit longer because I don't love the way this looks on me. I've heard some similar commentary on the Harlow hat before, because the way that Andrew Mallory wears it in the pattern photos is just in a single layer. So there's no brim, or there's no folded brim. She just wears it like this. I don't love the way that looks on me. I've tried it a few times and I just don't like it. I think like my ears kind of poke out a little bit and I just feel like it looks strange. So I always like to fold my hats so that there's a brim. I think it just looks a lot nicer, and it definitely fits like this. and it's not like too short in that it doesn't fit on my head. But I was watching Claire of the Pearl Wise podcast. I was watching her latest episode, and hers, because she was one of the ones who hosted the cow, she knit her hat probably like 2 to 3 inches taller than mine. And when she put it on, I was like, oh, that's exactly what I wish I would have done. Because mine, like the crown fits the top of my head perfectly, but her crown has just like a little extra volume at the top, and I think that just looks a lot nicer. So I tried to wear this a couple times and I ended up taking it off because I just felt like it didn't quite look the way that I wanted it to. So I think I'm gonna make another one, and I wanna make another hand spun. I don't really have any plans at the moment, but I think I would just wanna make like a 1 color hand spun Harlow and just make it like a few extra inches so that it fits the way that I want it to. Moving on to whips, I have 2 projects that I'm actively working on right now, and one of them you have seen before, so I'll show you this one first. This is my neon muscle burra. I've been working on this for what feels like forever. It's obviously a lot of stockinette in the round, and this one is fingering weight. I'm using a skein from Cascade. It is the Cascade Heritage, I believe. And it's just a like 75% superwash merino nylon blend. And I think this colorway is highlighter yellow. I am almost to the decreases. I think I have just a couple more inches to go. And I just found this stitch marker. I think I had this, I think this is the last time I showed you the progress on this. That doesn't necessarily seem right, but I feel like I would have moved it if I had shown it to you again, so I'll just go ahead and move it right now. All right, now it's moved, so you can see my progress next time. I am hoping to finish this very soon. I pick it up whenever I just need mindless knitting, and I'm not working on any socks at the moment, so this is definitely my mindless knitting project. But, you know, it's miles of stockinette, so it's fairly boring, but I'm so close that I really just want to finish this up as quickly as I can. Okay, I just turned a light on and I hope that was the play. These winter days are rough. My next whip is something I cast on because I really needed a colorful distraction. I am actually like shook at how far I've gotten into this project because I cast it on like a week ago and I almost have an entire fingering weight sweater. Here it is. This is a fade set from Tanis Fiber Arts that I made into a raglan. I just found off the body. So this very dark blue down here is the end of the fade. So it starts with, well, one end of it is this like bright bubblegum pink, and then of course it fades into this peachy orange, and then we've got green to blue. And then I started the first sleeve, and I worked the sleeve and the body in tandem right after I split for the sleeves because I was a little bit worried about how much yarn I had. So let me like back up a little bit and talk to you about how this project came about and what the yarn is. So this is the 12-day Advent set from Tanis Fiber Arts, and they had this as like a true Advent where it's a full mystery, but as you may know, I don't really like mystery yarn. I always like to know what I'm getting into before I buy stuff. So I actually waited for them to like show the full photo of what the set was before I bought it. I bought it during their Boxing Day sale, so this was like right at the end of December. And I've thought about buying their yarn before because they have a pure wash line, which is superwash yarn, but done in a little bit more of an eco-friendly way. I don't know exactly what their process is for making their yarn superwash, but What I do know is that there's a few different ways that you can do it that is better for the environment and better for the employees who are processing the yarn. As I understand it, the traditional way to treat superwash wool is that you use chlorine to like strip the scales of the wool. And that's just a very harsh chemical and can cause a lot of issues. So there's a few different ways that you can do the same thing without using chlorine. One is using enzymes to treat the wool. Another way is to use more organic chemicals that kind of act like chlorine but are just a lot less harsh for the environment and for the people who are working in that environment. So I always thought the concept was interesting. I don't buy a lot of superwash and I don't work with it very often, but you know, if there's a more eco-friendly way to do something, I'm always going to choose that option if I can. So here's the set that I bought. It came with 12 95 gram mini skeins. So just in the fade mini skeins, there is 1,140 yards. And so that was going to be like just enough to potentially knit a sweater for me. And this is fingering weight, if I hadn't mentioned that. And then it also came with this full-size skein. This is in the colorway Mood Ring. And this full skein just has kind of a lot of the colors that you see in the fade. So let's talk about the pattern, because when I first bought this set, I was planning on knitting the City Limits Light, which is a pattern by Tanis. It is a raglan and it's pretty simple, but it is sort of like made for a fade. Obviously fades were like very popular a few years ago. Well, like 10 years ago. Jesus. They're not as much anymore, but they're still fun. But I had never knit a fade, and so I figured I would buy this pattern and have it kind of walk me through it. But one of the biggest things with raglans as a person who has a larger bust is that they can not look great sometimes on me. And so I knew that I wanted to knit a compound raglan. Basically, you just vary the increase rate along the raglan seams so that it's not just like a 45-degree angle and it kind of matches the shape of your body better and it just fits better. And the City Limits pattern is fairly simple. You know, there's only like a few details to it, and I figured if I was gonna go as far as modifying the like main shaping in the pattern, I may as well just improvise my own sweater. And also because the nature of fade sets being like so variable, there's not really a way to write a pattern to tell you exactly like how much of each color you should use in order to like match the body with the sleeves and all of that. So I figured I wasn't really gonna get any like extra information from buying the pattern. So all of that to say, I just created my own. And before I show you, I'm gonna flip this inside out because even though I'm knitting it on the knit side, I intend to wear it on the purl side. I've just always been a fan of the way reverse stockinette looks with fades. So let me show you. So I think they did a really good job dyeing these mini skeins so that it fades into each other quite well. Obviously we're jumping from very different colors, so there's going to be a little bit of striping, especially through like this section, but overall I'm really happy with the way these colors faded together. I also changed up the way that I faded my colors, so I started out fading them very gradually at the beginning of the sweater, and then as I added more colors, I sort of figured out that because I didn't have much of each color, a less gradual color change worked better. So starting up here, I actually started with the fade instructions that Tanis has on her blog, which is a very gradual fade. And then I moved on to the instructions that Summer Lee has, which is a little bit less gradual. And then I actually kind of came up with my own very short fade. And I think, again, just because I didn't have much of each color, I like that shorter fade quite a bit more. So this whole thing was a bit of an experiment. And like I said, I just needed a colorful distraction. I didn't want to try to make the perfect sweater. I just wanted to have fun with it. Well, I yapped too long yesterday and I had to go make dinner. My tofu was pressing and I had to make my stir fry. So when I first realized that I wanted to create my own design, I hesitate to call it designing or pattern writing, but when I decided to improvise my own sweater, I pulled out the Knitter's Handy Book of Top-Down Sweaters by Anne Budd, and I figured I would use the raglan pattern in this book as a base and then just modify it to be a compound raglan. But I had an issue because the pattern in this book starts with a staggered start, which is a good way to start a raglan, but wasn't the way that I wanted to do it because I wanted to start with the ribbing and use up as much of this pink yarn as I had. When you do a staggered start, that is where you typically start knitting flat and you start beneath the ribbing and you work back and forth to do the short row shaping, and then you join in the round, you knit the body, and then you come back and you pick up the stitches for the neckband. But I knew that I just wanted to cast on the neck and start knitting, so I didn't end up using the pattern in this book and I just totally came up with my own. But honestly, it's very simple to do. So I, of course, took my gauge. I knit a gauge swatch out of the full-size skein just so that I wasn't wasting any of my mini skeins. And I took inspiration from the City Limits Light because that gauge is 6 stitches per inch on a fingering weight yarn, which is fairly loose. And I wanted to do that mostly because I knew I didn't have a lot of yarn. And so I wanted to be able to make a looser fabric that I knew would stretch a little bit since it's superwash. So I started with a fairly wide neck in order to use as little yarn as possible. I cast on 140 stitches. For the ribbing, I used a US 3, and then for the rest of the body, I went up to a US 6. From there, I knit the ribbing, just one by one ribbing, and then you can see that I knit short rows, so the back is higher than the front. I just used German short rows. I put them on the back 2/3 of the neck, and when you're working short rows top down on a raglan, you want to start with your shorter short rows and then get longer as you work them. I also worked them so that the short row turns gradually got further and further away from each other as I got closer to the front neck. And I stopped working them when I got to about here on each side. So again, that's 1/3 of the front where I didn't work any short rows. And while you're doing the short rows, you have to remember to work your raglan increases at the same time. So here's a visual of the shaping that I went for. It's fairly subtle, but starting at the neck until about here, I increased at a 45-degree angle, and then a large part of the shaping is at around a 60-degree angle until about here, and then the rest is worked again at a 45-degree angle until you get to the underarms. And this is very simple, but I added just a little ribbed detail. It is knit 2, purl 1, knit 2 in between the raglan increase stitches. And I just used make ones, but I changed the direction of the make ones. So on the left side, I knit a make one right and vice versa. And once I got to the underarm, I blocked the yoke so that I could see how it grew. And I tried it on to make sure it fit. So the way that I figured out the compound raglan is from a book. I'm sure there are online resources as well, but I used Sweater Design in Plain English by Maggie Righetti. This author is credited with coming up with, or at least documenting, the compound raglan, and she explains it in one of the raglan patterns in this book. So this is the graphic that she gives you. I'm just covering up some writing that I did years ago when I was trying to design a raglan, but this is the basic idea. So if you're working this from the top down, from the neck to the shoulder tip, you work at a 45-degree angle, which for most knit stitches is going to be an increase every other round. From there until the underarm, so the majority of the raglan, you work at a 60-degree angle, which is generally going to be an increase every 4 rounds. And then you go back to the 45-degree angle for, I think she says an inch. Yeah, an inch at the underarm for women and an inch and a half for men. So, you know, you can adjust that however. And she also has this page giving you this tip that drawing out the shape on graph paper is an easy way to figure this out for yourself. And I mean, you could also easily do that in a spreadsheet. I think the most difficult part about designing a compound raglan is just ensuring that you can get the same yoke depth as a regular raglan. So if you want, you know, say 1 to 2 inches of ease at the arm side for just a general fit, you do have to make some adjustments, because if the majority of your raglan increases happen every 4th round, but for a lot of raglans out there, all of them occur every other round, you're going to have more rounds than you are enough stitches. Basically, you're just going to have a deeper raglan yoke. And so you kind of have to figure out like how that's going to work for you. So I modified Maggie Righetti's formula a little bit. So I took my total yoke depth that I wanted, and for 35%, I increased every other round. For 55%, I increased every 4th round, and then for 10%, I went back to increasing every other round. Of course, there are a lot of different ways you can do it, and you don't have to like stick to any of these formulas, but I did a lot of different calculations, and I found that that ratio of increases produced the shape that I was wanting while also keeping the yoke depth in line with other raglan patterns that I found. A couple other shaping things that I did that you don't often see in like more traditional raglan patterns is I started with fewer sleeve stitches so that as I was increasing, my sleeves were not getting huge. I've definitely knit raglans before where your sleeves are just like 2 times as big as they should be. So I started with fewer sleeve stitches, and you can get a visual of that here. And I also started with more of my body stitches on the front than the back, not by a huge amount, but probably 10% or less than, so that my front would be a little bit bigger and roomier for my bust. I thought about decreasing those front stitches back out once I got like a few inches past the underarm, but I didn't end up doing that. I just knit the body with the same amount of stitches, so my back and front are not evenly split. And then I carried that ribbing detail down the sides of the body, so you can see that those ribbing details just extend onto the body. When I split for the sleeves at the underarm, I cast on an additional 10 stitches on each side of the body. So make sure to factor that in when you're doing your initial calculations. And then I also picked up 10 stitches for the sleeve. So each sleeve is gonna have an extra 10 stitches, and then your body is gonna have an extra 20 stitches, and obviously sub in those numbers for your own numbers. Okay, the last thing I wanna mention before I stop talking about this sweater is how I figured out the fade, because I wanted to use up every inch of yarn that I had. So because I knew I wanted to use all 95 grams of each mini skein, and because this is a top-down raglan, I knew that I didn't have to figure out any color management until I split for the sleeves. So for the entire yoke, I just knit each color until I ran out, but making sure that I had enough to fade in the next color. So right after I split for the sleeves, I immediately picked up the first sleeve and I started knitting the body at the same time that I was knitting the sleeve. So I would fade in the next color in the body, and then I would have that skein to fade in into the sleeve. And then I started weighing my skeins to figure out how many rounds I could get per gram in both the body and the sleeve, and just did some basic math to figure out, you know, how many rounds I needed to knit in the body in order to have enough for both sleeves, and then how many rounds I could knit in a solid color before I needed to fade in the next color. So as an example, I haven't finished this sleeve, of course, but for my next sleeve, for each color, I have about 5 grams of yarn left over. And so my plan is just to knit those 5-gram mini skeins into this sleeve. And obviously I'll just copy, what I've done on this one. And I think you can tell that this is actually a pretty long sweater. So I was concerned about having enough yarn, but I think all of the things that I did in combination to try to maximize the yarn worked, and I actually might end up with leftover yarn. And in fact, if I hold the sleeve up to the body, you can see that my sleeve is starting to get longer and the color shifts are starting to get a little bit lower than in the sleeve than they are in the body. And so I need to measure how long I want the sleeve to double check, but I may end up ripping out some of what I have in the sleeve and just knitting fewer rounds of each color to match the body a little bit better. Although I kind of have a feeling once it's on, you won't be able to tell. And also I want full length sleeves, so I'm just gonna prioritize the full length over the color management. So I'm almost done with this and I think I'll finish it pretty soon. It is mindless stockinette at this point, and I think the reason that I was able to get this done so fast is there's 2 reasons. One is that it's a fade, so I just wanted to get to the next color to see what it looked like. And then the other reason is that I was coming up with what I wanted to do next, and so that kept me very engaged. And so it was nice. This project kept me off of social media. I'm trying to do way less doom scrolling than I have for the past 8 years. Okay, so those are all my active whips, but now I want to talk about future projects because I've done some swatching and I've got some plans coming up. The first is for a sweater for my partner, my boyfriend, who has been waiting for a sweater for a couple years now. And we have done so much planning and collaborating to try to figure out exactly what he's looking for. In my finishing up my goals video, I talked a little bit about some of the criteria that he wanted, and most of that I think has changed at this point. So we've gone through quite a few iterations and ideas, and I think we have mostly settled on what I'm gonna do. So here's the swatch. It's looking really cool. It's just a conceptual swatch, so I'll need to swatch for my gauge, but he wanted something very specific, which was a black yarn with neon colorful speckles, and we both looked for a really long time for the exact yarn. We found a lot of black yarn with colorful speckles or colorful tweed, but none of them were exactly what he was looking for. And so I ended up holding a colorful yarn with black yarn to get this effect. And this is like exactly what he wanted. So I've swatched a few different stitch patterns. This down here is the Traveler stitch pattern because I'm pretty sure that's the pattern I'm going to end up knitting. In the middle here is stockinette, and then I just also swatched some garter stitch to see what that looked like. And because this yarn is so bulky, which was what he wanted a super bulky yarn. He wants a very big sweater, as he described it. So because it's so bulky, it doesn't look as good to us as it does in a lighter weight. But we're still kind of deciding because it's cool. But I think we're gonna go with the stockinette. And this swatch is with 3 strands of worsted weight yarn. I held 2 of the black and 1 of the colorful yarn. I did a couple swatches with 1 of each, so 1 black and 1 colorful yarn. And you can see that it's quite a bit more colorful. But as soon as I did this, we both really liked how the color is a little bit more subtle. So the black is just some worsted weight yarn that I had in my stash to try out the idea, but the colorful yarn is from Menostel, Uruguay. It is the Alegria Grande, so it's their worsted weight. And this colorway is Huarache. It's a really cool colorway, and it just hit the mark. It was all the colors that we were looking for, and especially paired with the black, it just looks so cool. So I just ordered the yarn for this, and it's special order, so it's gonna take a few weeks to get all of it in. But he is very excited for this, and he keeps asking me how quickly I think I can knit it. He wants to be able to wear it this winter, and I think he will be pretty disappointed if he's not able to. So as soon as I get the rest of the yarn in, I will cast this on. And I guess it's TBD on the pattern. Obviously, if I do the Traveler, I'll need to modify it for a bulky weight or a super bulky. whatever gauge I end up getting. But we're also thinking about the super basic drop sleeve sweater by James in Watts. So if the Traveler doesn't work out, I'll probably just end up making that one. The biggest thing is that he wants a hood. So if I knit the James in Watts pattern, I'll add a hood, probably something modified from the Traveler hoodie. And this is so funny. At the grocery store the other day, we picked up trolleys, which we never buy. And I think there was some subliminal messaging going on. So that's future project number 1. My next sweater cast on for myself after I finish the fade raglan is going to be the Un sweater by November Knits. Quite a few people on my Instagram feed have made one recently, but a few YouTubers who come to mind, I know Kendra from Balanced Skein has knit one. Mackenzie from Into the Third knit one in this exact colorway, so I low-key copied her. I'm really excited to cast mine on. I'm a little bit surprised at myself that I'm ready to cast on another stockinette raglan. I guess there is a lot of ribbing, but I usually like to vary up my projects a little bit more than that. But I'm ready to cast this on. And if you hadn't recognized the skein, this is Knitting for Olive Heavy Merino, and this is in the colorway Blood Orange. It's a little scratchy. I kind of wasn't expecting that since it is merino, but hopefully it'll hold up well. So I'm excited to see how it does. And I think it did get a little bit softer when I blocked my swatch. I swatched for this last night, so I guess this was good timing that I had to split this over 2 days so you get to see my swatch. This swatch looks a little crazy because I combined multiple swatches into one, but I went up a needle size because I could tell that my gauge was coming out a little smaller. The pattern calls for a DK and a lace weight mohair held together, and so I figured the worsted weight would be a good substitute. But I think without the mohair, my gauge is just a little bit smaller. It doesn't have that extra fluff to fill in the stitches. So once this dries, I will take my gauge and we'll see what I got. And then I also swatched the ribbing in 2 different needle sizes. The third project plan, because I can't help myself, is a spinning project. So exciting news, I finally fixed my e-spinner. It's my Dreaming Robots EEW6. For quite a while, I was having an issue with it randomly stopping, and there is a guide for how to handle that if it's caused by static buildup. So I went through that guide and I tried all the troubleshooting solutions, but nothing was fixing it. So the issue is that when I had the foot pedal plugged in, my e-spinner would stop after about a minute of spinning. But when I unplugged the foot pedal, I didn't have an issue. So for a while there, I was just spinning without the foot pedal. I would just flip the switch to turn it on. But as you can imagine, it was really annoying and I wanted to get it fixed. So I emailed Maurice and he immediately responded, which was great. I emailed him at like 8 p.m. my time and then he responded at like 3:30 a.m. my time. And he said that it was likely the circuit board and he recommended buying the upgraded version, the 6.1 circuit board, and replacing it with that. So I immediately bought it. It was like 20 bucks, but it took me a while to install it because on the EEW6, beneath the PCB, there is a plastic, just a little piece of plastic support holding one of the connectors for the screw. And so you have to remove that plastic before you can install the new PCB. Luckily, a few years ago, we got a Dremel as a gift. It's a really nice one, but neither of us had used it. So I had to like set it up and read the manual and all of that. So I finally did all of that. I was able to remove that piece of plastic fairly easily. I think it would have been harder without a Dremel. So I'm not sure what I would have done if I didn't have that tool, but I was able to replace the PCB and it fixed the problem. At least as far as I can tell. I haven't done any spinning projects on it, but I let it go for a while and I didn't have any issues. So now that I can use my e-spinner comfortably again, I am planning my next spinning project. And this is the fiber that I'm going to spin. This is from Nest Fiber. It is from her Winter 2023 club. So this was in November. And look at this fiber. It is so gorgeous. I'm so excited to spin with this. And I'll talk more about what I have planned once I start spinning it. Okay, so that is all of the knitting and project discussion, but I thought I would add a couple sections to these episodes whenever I do them. I don't usually talk about like what I'm reading and watching, but I got back into reading like late 2023, and so I read a lot more last year than I usually do. And so far this year, I've read 2 books. So I want to talk about what I've been reading. I'll also briefly talk about what I'm watching. And I thought it would be fun to talk about what I have been cooking and baking. I love to cook and I meal plan every week. And so I thought if there was anything especially like stand out that I've made, I can just mention it. I know all of this is so groundbreaking for a knitting podcast. So first up, what I've been reading, the first book is literary fiction. This is Nothing to See Here by Kevin Wilson. This book is about 2 long-lost friends who reconnect because one of the friends needs help raising her 2 stepkids. The reason she needs help is that these 2 children will randomly catch fire whenever they're going through some like big emotion. It's funny, it's unique, and if you like stories about family and found family and being accepted and accepting yourself, then I think you would like this book. I really enjoyed it. I love literary fiction. It gives me such an interesting perspective into the minds of other types of people. Another big theme is parenthood and what it means to be a parent, how that affects you, how that affects the children. And there's an essay by the author at the end of the book that's just a few pages long, but he talks about what his 2 sons mean to him and kind of how he thought he couldn't be a parent, but he realized that it is more complicated and nuanced than what he thought. I wouldn't call this a content warning exactly, but if you had a tough childhood, you might just want to be aware of that going into this one. It might make you feel some things. On a totally different note, I also read this book. This is Done and Dusted by Lyla Sage. I think the 4th one just came out. And it is just a cowboy romance set on a ranch in Montana. It's fun and very easy to read. I found some of it a little cringe at times, but overall the vibes were immaculate and there's very little plot, but that's not why we're all reading it. I haven't picked up the next one yet, but let's be honest, I'll probably end up reading them all. Save a horse, ride a cowboy. And then the book that I'm currently reading is another vibe switch. It is on my Kindle. It is The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi by Shannon Chakraborty. This is a historical fantasy. We are following our main character who is a retired pirate. She is also a mother and a Muslim, and we're following her on the Indian Ocean in the 12th century. I just started it. I'm less than 10% in, so I don't really know the main plot, but I've heard really good things. As far as what I'm watching, Severance season 2 is taking up every bit of space in my brain right now. We waited 3 years for this season, and it was absolutely worth the wait. I have loved every second of it. I don't want to give anything away, so all I'll say is that I really like how quickly they move the plot along. They are not dragging anything out, and I think that's refreshing for TV. And all the actors in this show deserve Emmys. Wow, they are all so incredibly good. I also recently watched the movie A Real Pain. It was nominated for an Oscar. It's directed by Jesse Eisenberg, and it stars him and Kieran Culkin. And so you can probably imagine the dynamic that exists between the two. They are both 2 cousins who have kind of lost touch with each other in recent years, and they both are a little bit bitter towards each other for different reasons, but they're trying to reconnect, and they go on a Holocaust tour in Poland to honor their grandmother who had just passed away. I liked this movie a lot. Ever since Jesse Eisenberg was in Fleischman is in Trouble, a TV show, I have been watching what he's been up to, and Kieran Culkin is just always endlessly entertaining. I thought there were a lot of good themes that were pretty understated. It doesn't hit you over the head with overt messaging, but it's really stuck with me, and I've thought about what the characters are going through and the ways that they hold their pain and express it differently. And I like that there wasn't like a huge conclusion of self-actualization from the characters. They both kind of go back to the way that their life was before the trip. It's very raw and real, and it sat with me since I watched it. There are a lot of good quotes, and it's really funny despite being on a backdrop of these horrific events, and it is tough to watch at times. But if you're the kind of person who usually avoids Oscar-nominated movies for various reasons, maybe you should check this one out. I feel like it doesn't follow the typical Oscar bait type of formula. So I mentioned that I love to cook, and I like to get inspiration from others on what they're eating for dinner. It doesn't have to be like these grand, difficult recipes, but I like to just know what people are eating and what they're cooking. So a recipe that I made last week is from Sarah's Vegan Kitchen. She's a YouTuber. I actually just discovered her a couple weeks ago, and so far I really like her recipes. We're not vegan, but we're probably like 70% vegetarian, so we don't eat a lot of meat. And I made this tofu katsu, and it was delicious. It's so good, and honestly way easier to cook than tonkatsu, so I'll leave the recipe for that below. And then as far as desserts, because I do love to bake as well, I recently made this no-bake cheesecake from Sally's Baking. It has a graham cracker crust, which is so good, and this cheesecake is super easy. I mean, you don't have to bake it, so you literally just mix up the ingredients, and as she says in the recipe, it is very lightweight, so you don't get that like super heavy feeling that you might get if you eat normal cheesecake. And this one was also just really delicious. I can definitely recommend. So that's all I have for this video. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next one, hopefully. Bye!